From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House January 6 inquiry dives into President Trump's 2020 plan to appoint alternative slates of electors as the Supreme Court rules on a Maine case involving religion and school choice. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Tuesday's edition of the January 6 mini-series focused on the plan after the 2020 election to get alternative electors appointed. And the effort was wider than at least I knew. According to the committee, there were purported Trump electors who met to cast phony electoral votes in 7 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Nevada, and Wisconsin. And one precedent that has been cited for this was John F. Kennedy in 1960. And I'll just read a few lines of a Politico article. It says, by December 1960, it was clear Kennedy had won. Only Hawaii's result remained in doubt. Nixon had prevailed by just 140 votes. And so when Nixon's Hawaii electors met and cast their 3 votes in an official ceremony, nearby Kennedy's 3 elector nominees gathered and signed their own certificates. And the result in that case was that the recount showed, unlike the initial count, that Kennedy had won. And so those electors went on to cast those electoral ballots, and those were the ones that were counted for Kennedy. But the difference in this case seems to me that there were no recounts underway in some of these states, and the fraud claims had already been batted down. So one witness Tuesday was the Speaker of the Arizona House, Rusty Bowers, who said he supported Trump, he voted for him, but he kept asking for hard evidence of voter fraud that never arrived. And here's how he described one meeting that he had with Rudy Giuliani.
My recollection, he said, we've got lots of theories, we just don't have the evidence. And I don't know if that was a gaffe or maybe he didn't think through what he said, but both myself and others in my group, the 3 in my group and my council, both remembered that specifically, and afterwards we kind of laughed about it.
Kim, what do you make of this alternative slate of elector business in retrospect?
Well, in retrospect, I wish the committee would be a little bit more clear. One of the things that's been frustrating when you watch this is there seems to be this effort to lump together every effort around an alternate slate of electors as this sort of terrible offense. In my mind, the simple effort to assemble a group of contingent electors, which was underway in some states in November and even in parts of December, while there were ongoing court cases that could have changed the results, they were still being litigated. And indeed, in a couple of those states you mentioned, Pennsylvania and New Mexico, those electors who actually signed their names on a thing for Trump included the caveat saying, assuming that these court battles actually go in Donald Trump's favor. That to me is not necessarily anything egregious. The efforts that they were showing and highlighting to pressure state legislators to simply certify an alternate slate of electors in absence of a court win or in absence of any evidence, and in contrast to the slate that a governor was certifying, that's certainly a far more problematic operation and something that you would have really hoped shouldn't have happened. Now, the good news, again, is that no state legislature actually did that in the end. And so we were spared that conflict in terms of Mike Pence wasn't receiving alternate slates of electors when he went to do the counting. But, there are some distinctions to be made here.
I think that's a good point. And the idea that a state legislator would take back the electors that the voters chose and try to directly appoint electors, I think is more constitutionally dangerous. But it also seems clear to me that it would not withstand legal scrutiny, because Congress has said that Election Day is the time for choosing electors. Congress has that responsibility, that power under the Constitution. So I just think it would be straight unlawful for a state that has set up a popular vote system to, after the popular vote, try to do take-backsies and appoint new electors. The other thing about these alternative slates is, similarly, I think there were issues with the law that they did not follow the rules in those states for casting electoral votes. And it seems to be a little bit of a shambolic effort. So there was testimony Tuesday by the former head of the Michigan Republican Party And she said that in Michigan, the law says that the electoral votes have to be cast in the Capitol. And she spoke to someone on the campaign who told her that the Michigan Republican electors were planning to meet in the Capitol and hide overnight so that they could fulfill the role of casting their vote in the Michigan chambers. I told him in no uncertain terms that that was insane and inappropriate. There was also a text message exchange that the committee put up between a staffer for Senator Ron Johnson in Wisconsin and a staffer for Mike Pence. And this is on the January 6th, the day of the counting of the votes. And the Johnson staffer says that the senator needs to hand something to the vice president. The Pence staffer says, what is it? The Johnson staffer says, alternative slate of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin, because the archivist didn't receive them. And the Pence staffer says, do not give that to him. And Monet, it does suggest, again, that this was not a very well planned effort. If it was planned at all, it seems to have been pretty chaotic and quite a mess.
Yeah, that's definitely exactly right. I do think that this is in keeping with a lot of what we've seen from the January 6th committee so far, which is that on the one hand, they're showing new details about just how crazy some of these theories about the sort of stolen election thesis were, and the efforts of some of the Trump operatives and allies to try to find ways to work around the edges of the system to try to see if they could change the direction of the election. But then we also have seen the unanimity of the actual decision makers within the Republican Party in terms of expressing skepticism about these maneuvers and theories and putting the kibosh on them in a way that prevented them from going forward. So in that Michigan example, it is kind of shocking to see that people would even consider the possibility of having this alternative slate of electors sneak into the Capitol building in Lansing and potentially cast votes in secret that then could be sent to Washington. But on the other hand, we did see Laura Cox, that former leader of the Michigan Republican Party, very quickly and very clearly saying that they weren't going to go ahead with that maneuver. And the same thing in Wisconsin. You had Chris Hodgson, who was the Pence staffer, basically saying, we want nothing to do with this alternative slate of electors. And so it is a shame that you did have these people maneuvering to try to see if they could change the outcomes. It's almost as if they were depending on the integrity of the system to prevent their harebrained schemes from actually becoming real. But on the other hand, people should rest assured that the system held up when it was tested, and that the Republicans who are actually in a position to put these plans into action declined to do so at a variety of different stages.
Also testifying Tuesday was Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who is fresh from a resounding primary re-election victory. Here are two clips of what he said.
We had many allegations, and we investigated every single one of them. In fact, I challenged my team, did we miss anything? They said that there was over 66,000 underage voters. We found that there's actually zero. You can register to vote in Georgia. When you're 17 and a half, you have to be 18 by Election Day. We checked that out, every single voter. They said that there was 2,423 non-registered voters. There was zero. They said that there was 2,056 felons. We identified less than 74 or less that were actually still in felony sentence. Every single allegation we checked. We ran down the rabbit trail to make sure that our numbers were accurate. I've been traveling through the state of Georgia for a year now, and simply put, in a nutshell, what happened in fall of 2020 is that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential race, and yet they voted down ballot in other races. And the Republican congressman ended up getting 33,000 more votes than President Trump, and that's why President Trump came up short.
I think that's a fascinating number that I'm not sure I've seen before, that Republican congressman in Georgia got 33,000 more votes than President Trump did. And as a reminder, Trump lost the state of Georgia to President Biden by less than 12,000 votes. And in the public data you can get for Wisconsin, there are similar figures. Trump lost Wisconsin by about 21,000 votes. And the same election day, same set of voters, they elected 5 Republican congressmen. Those Republican congressmen got 64,000 votes more than Trump did, or 3 times his losing margin. And so, Kim, that's a question I keep going back to, is when you have numbers of split tickets like this, people who are voting Republican down ballot, but not voting for President Trump, then who needs complicated theories about, ballot drops and fraud?
Right. And look, this is also just reflective of a lot of the other data that came out and exit polls that came out, which is that Donald Trump in particular lost a lot of suburban support. Remember, we were at the mayhem of COVID, all those briefings. You could see his approval numbers going down. The economy, people have been in lockdowns. It was a very tough time to be the White House. And there were very clearly a significant number of Americans who voted Republican when it came to the Senate or to their House members, but either did not mark Donald Trump's name on the presidential ballot or voted for Joe Biden. And again, it all kind of fits into a much simpler, as you say, Kyle, description of what happened in the election, which is that the White House had a very unfortunate 2020. Donald Trump, in many ways, made it worse with some of his ways of approaching some of these problems, and it was reflected on the day of election.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. A couple more thoughts here on the latest January 6th stuff. One is, why does President Trump continue to make these fraud claims even long after they have been debunked? And an interesting note here, one potential answer is that he's trying to avoid criminal liability, because as we've discussed on previous podcasts, one of the things that a prosecutor would have to do if the January 6th committee made a referral, which some of its members seem to want it to do, to the Justice Department, one of the things the prosecutor would need to do is prove that President Trump had a guilty mind, which generally means that he was making claims that he knew were false. And the difficulty there is that President Trump has claimed all along that he thought it was fraud, and the arguments for that keep changing. First it was Dominion voting machines, now it's 2,000 mules. In an odd way, the more that he makes these claims, the better his defense is, I think. And there was an interesting report on that point. He recently put out another one of these long statements making various fraud claims. And the New York Times reports that that was drafted in part by a white-collar defense lawyer and former federal prosecutor. And if that's true, it suggests that Monet, in an odd sort of way, the more that he keeps making these unhinged claims, the harder it may be for a prosecutor to prove that he knew what he was doing was wrong all along.
Yeah, it definitely seems plausible to me that Trump is in part thinking about his legal defense in continuing to perpetuate the fraud claims. This is something that we've been talking about for a long time throughout the entire saga of the January 6th committee and even before. If you look at something like John Eastman's alleged theories that he gave to the White House to try to suggest that Vice President Trump had the ability to change the electoral count, that is one instance where you have them basically trying to come up with a legal theory for why it was possible, and it kind of depended on the idea that they had some legitimate reason to want to challenge the slate of electors that was sent to Congress. If it came out that they had never believed that there was anything fishy about the results in the states, then they would be in much deeper legal trouble presenting a theory like that, because they would be very deliberately trying to falsify the outcome of the election rather than merely write it. And I think you can take that same principle and extend it to all the other sort of areas where are allegations that President Trump tried to controvert the legitimate outcome of the election. If they thought that they had a valid reason to do so because there was fraud from the Democratic Party, then they would be on a much stronger legal footing. But I do think generally the reason that Trump continues to sort of perpetuate the fraud theories has much more to do with him trying to sustain his influence in the Republican Party. There are a lot of his core supporters around the country who very strongly believe that the election was stolen, and Trump wants to keep those voters activated and show that he isn't fading away or giving in to his critics. And so it just kind of keeps him much more in the news. It keeps some of his strongest supporters aggrieved about the wrongs that they believe were done to him by the Democratic Party and by some within the Republican Party. And so I think that if you're looking for an explanation for why he keeps doing this, why he keeps piping up about the fraud claims, it has much more to do with politics and his personal brand probably than it does to do with the legal strategy.
Kim, you've been a critic of the one-sidedness of the January 6th committee, and an interesting note there is that Trump is now saying that he wishes Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, had appointed some Republicans to it. And just to do a refresher of what happened here, there were some Republican members that McCarthy appointed. They were rejected by Nancy Pelosi, and McCarthy responded by essentially saying the Republican caucus would boycott the committee. And then Nancy Pelosi chose a couple of Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, to join the committee. But Trump is now telling Punchbowl News this. He says, I think it would have been far better to have Republicans when Pelosi wrongfully didn't allow them. We should have picked other people. We have a lot of good people in the Republican Party, unquote. And Kim, what do you make of that? Do you think he might be right there?
I don't agree with him. I think he's wrong on that because you actually have to go back farther. Originally, Nancy Pelosi was proposing an actual commission. And even though there is a very narrow divide right now between Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate, I mean, in the Senate, for instance, it's 50-50. She wanted a commission where 7 of the members would be chosen by Democrats and 4 by Republicans. It would have been very unweighted. And the Republicans said no. Then we get to this special committee and the story that you tell, Kyle, and she vetoed Kevin McCarthy's picks. And this had never happened in the entire history of the House. And it would have been a quite difficult precedent for McCarthy to swallow. I would have been surprised if he actually rolled over for that. And I think even for institutional reasons, it was quite important not to just roll over to that, to abide by the notion that the minority party gets to tell you which of your members sit on a committee. She did it anyway. I think that that sets some very bad precedents for the future. It is a real pity that there isn't more of an opposition or adversarial stance on this, because that is normally how you get to the root of information. Maybe it would be better, I guess, except for it really was a rock and a hard place for McCarthy. And I still come down on the side that he probably was right to just pull his team.
Other big news on Tuesday, the Supreme Court ruling 6-3 against Maine's restriction on its tuition program and in favor of religious schools. So Maine is a rural state. And in some rural areas, there are school districts that don't run their own high schools. And parents in those areas can choose a school, a public or private school, and they get some tax dollars to put towards tuition at that school. But there's an exclusion for religious schools. And 6-3 majority of the Supreme Court, Monet, says that is a violation of the First Amendment right to free exercise of religion. What do you make of this ruling and the implication?
Yeah, the ruling seems frankly open and shut to me. I mean, as you said, the First Amendment guarantees people's right to a free exercise of religion. Historically, that has been interpreted to mean that government programs have to be distributed equally to all comers, and that includes religious people. You can't exempt people for adhering to a particular religion or to a religion in general. And so that means if a state like Maine or any other state is creating a public program where they're offering a subsidy to private schools, if it's available to secular schools, it has to also be available to religious schools. So it's very straightforward. I think it really sort of boggles the mind to see the response that this ruling is getting from some corners. People say it's encroachment on the separation of church and state to have a public benefit going to religious schools. That would be true if it were going specifically to religious schools, but again, this is a general benefit which is going to all private schools, and so there's no doubt that religious schools should be able to claim it just like any others.
And a couple of points that are made by the dissent. The dissent is by Justice Stephen Breyer. He says, first of all, that this ruling forces Maine to fund religious schools, and the response by the majority is written by Chief Justice John Roberts, is that no, Maine has all sorts of policy choices that it can make. It can expand the reach of its public schools. It can move to some remote learning. It can fund transportation. What he's saying it can't do is it can't offer a subsidy for private schools and exclude some schools simply because they're religious and they offer religious instruction to students. As for the point that Monet brings up about the Establishment Clause, because the First Amendment also says that there shall be no law respecting an establishment of religion. Kim, I just don't understand why pluralism is not the answer, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And if some evangelical people in Maine take that tuition money to evangelical schools and some Buddhists take it to Buddhist schools, then the more the merrier, especially as there becomes more and more controversy about what the public schools are teaching. I think it's important to have a right of exit for parents and a way for people to get the educations that they want for their children.
Right, especially because that diversity that you mentioned, which we should all want, we should want a great deal of choice and, as you said, all those flowers blooming. The problem is that when you begin to target religion per se and put it in a separate category, it also calls for you to end up having very thorny and unsolvable discussions about what counts as religion. And this was brought up in both the dissent and the majority opinion. The dissent complained that this would be money that would be going to schools that promote religious views. But one of the things that came up in oral arguments, and I can't remember which justice it was who said it, but he talked about how what if you had a Unitarian Universalist school and it didn't really teach any dogma, religious dogma, but instead it promoted equality and charity. Is that promoting a religious view? What counts as religion when we have more than 100 established religions across the country, if not more? Who gets to make the call on what is too much religion or what is dogma? This is a much, much cleaner way of doing it. And just as an overall, too, I would have to wager it didn't come up as much, but a lot of the justices, the 6 justices who vote for this, they are people that tend to go back and dig deep and look at the foundings of the Constitution and what was on the minds of people at that time. And it's long been understood that that separation of church and state was primarily designed to protect religion from the state, not to protect the state from religion. And that has to be an animating idea when we think about that separation as well, too.
Well, we'll have to see what the Supreme Court has in store later this week. There were dozens of cases that were left to release opinions about, and now the Supreme Court seems to be moving. I'm not sure what the holdup was, but now they're doing 5 opinions when they release them on a day, and they are going to release opinions, they say, on Thursday and on Friday. So, Monet, it's possible we will get 5 or 10 or 13 cases here by the end of the week, but we're still waiting on the New York gun law. We're still waiting on the Mississippi abortion case. And so, as usual, the Supreme Court is holding the big ones for the last days. And we don't know exactly when the last days will be, but I guess tune in later this week to find out.
Yes, that's right. I do think that people in particular are waiting for the release of the Dobbs case. And a lot of people had advised the Supreme Court to actually fast-track the release of that case after it was leaked to the press some time ago. I think that would have been wise for a variety of reasons, but we can all speculate on why they haven't done that. One reason is possibly that it has a lot of concurrences and dissents attached to it, which means it took a long time to finalize, which then would push back the timeline for getting the final ruling out. But another reason that people have speculated about is that the growing threat around the Supreme Court, sort of a direct threat in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, and just a general sense of unrest that we've been seeing from some of these left-wing groups, has made the Supreme Court want to save the Dobbs opinion for the very last possible moment so they can make sure their business for the term is concluded and then get out of Washington and into safety as quickly as possible. That's a very grim thought, but I think that's highly possible. But whichever of these options is, we know that we're going to get the release at some time soon, and so yes, people are going to be watching very avidly.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.